Williams.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to come after the Honourable Phil Heatley, who just ridiculed the Greens for opposing this bill. And I've got sad news and bad news for Mr. Heatley, because New Zealand First is opposing it as well. So this is not going to make your day. I'm sorry, Mr. Heatley, it's not going to make your day at all. And we do so on the basis of a little bit of knowledge and experience in this area, rather than what has come out of the national government. Also, we do it on the basis of the submissions that were made to the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, and we work on the basis that if there are submissions from the public, from the interested parties, from the affected groups, we pay heed to what they say. And in this case, I sat on the local government hearings on this matter, and we travelled around New Zealand to quite a few different places. In Auckland and Wellington and other centres, and we heard from the grassroots. And we heard from them, and I quote, the likes of a developer in Tauranga who was there, and he spoke just before the Mayor of Tauranga and representatives of the Tauranga area. And the developer in Tauranga, who I would actually pick as being a national voter, because he gave me that impression. He was a fairly well-heeled gentleman, and he looked like he'd made a donation or two to the Tories over his time. But he actually said in his submission that this legislation was crazy. This is madness. This was just stupid to be going ahead with it. And the reason he said was, in the case of Tauranga, this would have a difference of about $750 per section in Tauranga, removing development contributions from community infrastructure, which is what this bill is partly about, removing the ability for councils, local authorities to charge development contributions against community infrastructure. And when I say community infrastructure, I'm talking sports fields, recreational facilities, I'm talking swimming pools, libraries, children's playgrounds, all sorts of community infrastructure that we expect in any decent town, city or district in this country. He said it is madness to be taking $750 off the development of a section, when he said in a place like Tauranga, $750 is neither here nor there. The market in Tauranga will determine the cost of a section and will determine the cost of a development of a house. And because that levy is there or not there, it will not mean that that house becomes $750 cheaper. But what it does mean, Mr. Speaker, and he said this, what it does mean is that councils such as Tauranga potentially will not go ahead when they are approving subdivision, when they're approving sections, when they're approving expansion and developments. They will not necessarily then go ahead with provision for sports fields or recreational facilities or local. They won't. And you know, Mrs. Dean, Jackie Dean, they said, and council after council said to us, this will create a huge difficulty for many of them. They will have to put a clampers on it. And in the case of Mr. Goldsmith, Mr. Paul Goldsmith, he had the cheek to say to some of these submitters, well, you can just stop spending money on these sorts of things. They don't have to have these things. They don't have to have these things in their communities. Oh, very nice for Mr. Goldsmith coming from Epsom, or does he come from Epsom? I'm not sure. Somewhere. But very nice for people who live in central Auckland who've got all the parks, have got all the recreational facilities, got all the sports fields, but in new areas, out in the back of Flatbush, out in the back of West Auckland, out in the back of South Auckland, where they're developing new subdivision, all that sort of thing. If the council says, sorry, but we are not getting sufficient contributions from the developers to go towards the infrastructure in this area, they may well put the clampers on what they can provide. And in the case of Auckland Council, we heard submissions from them that over the next 10 years, as a result of this, and this was under the original bill, the government's backed off and said, oh, no, well, we'll concede, we'll let existing projects that are already in the pipeline go ahead. So already they concede that they made an error. They already know they're wrong. So they're going, oh, OK, well, we'll let things that are already approved go ahead, but anything in the future will stop. Well, Auckland Council said under that original legislation, it was going to cost Auckland Council $450 million in the next 10 years, and in order to continue providing community infrastructure in areas of Auckland, and you're talking from Tahuna up the north, right down to Pukekohe in the south, they said that would be the equivalent of 8.5% over the 10 years on top of the rates in Auckland if they were to continue providing that community infrastructure. And they gave a sound warning. That is not good, sensible economics by anyone's standard to then try and impose that amount of money, $450 million, on the existing ratepayers of Auckland. So New Zealand First very much opposes this, because what it basically will do, Mr Speaker, is you're setting up two tiers now. Now that the government said, oh, well, existing schemes can go ahead that are already in place, but any new schemes or any new proposals, any new community projects that councils have won't be allowed to do this. It means that a lot of newer communities, the growth communities in New Zealand, the ones that are really needing, who are, not the old Dunedins of this world who've got everything, they've been there 100 years, but the new growth communities, the likes of Christchurch going ahead and growing and needing all sorts of new facilities, the likes of north of Auckland, the northwest of Auckland, which is the fastest growing area in Auckland, they need community infrastructure, and a lot of that will be cut back. And if it goes ahead, and if they continue to provide it, it will go on to the ratepayers. And the ones that we most fear will be those on fixed incomes, particularly elderly and the seniors, who are in their homes and have been in their homes for often many, many decades. They in turn will have to suffer increased rates because this national government has seen fit to remove a levy, a legitimate levy that the developers were being imposed by the councils to ensure that new development was paid for out of that. But it's typical of this government, because last year, as the people of New Zealand will know, last year they changed the Local Government Act to withdraw the 4 well-beings from the Local Government Act as well, which was in an earlier tranche of these reviews. And those 4 well-beings covered social, cultural, economic and environmental considerations by a council. They took those out. They just want councils to do footpaths, roads, sewerage and a few other, hard structured things, but telling councils don't get involved in your community. They're saying to communities all across New Zealand, that's no longer the council's job. They shouldn't be doing that. Well, Mr Speaker, I can assure you that councils around New Zealand are the community. We have 2 tiers of government in this country. We have the central government, and most of that's sitting here in Wellington, in vast ministries, vast bureaucracies, dreaming up the next thing that they can impose on local government. But it is local government that is the administer and deliver of services throughout this country, and they are the ones that are the glue in the communities of this country, and they provide the community well-being, and they ensure that a good community is a safe community, is a healthy community, and is a community where people want to live. And if they don't want to live there, they move out. Well, I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, but this government has a real downer on local government, and they are creating it into such a despised entity within government in this country that I'm surprised that local councillors, local mayors continue to stand. And I'm surprised that local mayors who are National Party supporters continue to support them, because quite frankly they spend half their life absolutely putting the boot into local government, and it's time it stopped. Mr Speaker, these development contributions were devised over many years, over the last 10 years, North Shore being one of the first councils to bring them in, and many case studies and many High Court cases were held to get the case studies in place so that there was fairness in the system. As a result of this, and putting this bill through, this act through, case studies through the High Court, well-proven ones, to show the legitimacy of it, will be cast aside. Mr Speaker, it's a nonsense that this government says this will save costs to housing, and we're surprised that Labor is supporting it. They should not be supporting this. It is so minimal. The order of $750 to $1,000 is neither here nor there on a $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 house in Auckland. It's absolute chicken feed for the overall thing. But what it will do, and I can assure you what it will do, it will impose increased pressure on councils. And the next thing we'll be hearing is more criticism from the National Party about rates imposed by councils. So they want it on both sides. They want the councils to maintain and constrain the rates. Fair enough, we all want them to do that. But how can they do that if this government, in the same breath, takes away other mechanisms that they should have in place to ensure that growth in their communities is covered not only by the existing ratepayers, but by the incoming ratepayers as well? Mr Speaker, I'm sorry, but New Zealand First will most certainly be voting against this, and we can assure the public of New Zealand that if we have any influence in the next government, we will revert and reverse these moves, including the 4 well-beings and including these community infrastructure levies. We will turn that around and we'll get it back on track.
I call Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That was